Russia and Ukraine have been in a state of conflict since 2014. That's when Russia invaded and wrested control of the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. In response, the US enacted a series of sanctions against Russia.
The Biden administration has warned this time around that it's willing to inflict more severe economic consequences.
Given that economic sanctions are the West's main deterrent here, I don't think this is something that they're going to mess around with.
8 years later, Russia has mobilized troops on Ukraine's border, and once again the US and European allies are threatening Russia with economic sanctions if they decide to use military force against Ukraine.
Well, Russia currently has over 100,000 troops built up on Ukraine's eastern border.
They want to revise the post-Cold War settlement. They want to talk about no more NATO expansion. They want to talk about no more NATO presence in countries like Ukraine, military presence of a structural or institutional nature, and looking at specific types of capabilities.
Economic sanctions remain a powerful weapon in America's foreign policy arsenal, but can they keep Russia at bay in 2022? After Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, the US quickly imposed a series of sanctions. The sanctions affected Russia's access to financial markets and also the ability to export certain items, notably military equipment.
So when you ask whether or not sanctions are effective, it's helpful to clarify that. Do they have an effect, right? Do they hurt Russia's economy? Do they change aspects of it? Yes, in that sense they are effective. Have they changed Russian policy? Well, some people will tell you that the imposition of sanctions and the fear of more sanctions have kept Russia from going further than it has. Others will tell you that they've done absolutely nothing.
Russia has so far not been deterred by the sanctions enacted in response to the Crimea annexation.
The Russian perspective on this was that in 2014, 2015, they were economically by far the weakest they'd been this decade. They were going through a recession. There was a real financial crisis in 2014. They underwent massive currency devaluation. They burned through quite a bit of reserves during that time period. Since then, they were able to stabilize the financial system. They were able to increasingly disconnect currency valuation from oil and energy prices.
What we've got is a lot of sanctions that have largely been applied as punishment and that are very difficult to understand how they get removed, in part because the US especially, but also Europe to some extent, have imposed a wide variety of sanctions on Russia for a wide range of things, such that it can be a little bit difficult to figure out what's what.
There are fewer people in Ukraine who see Russia as friendly today than there were in 2014. And so hopefully that will give President Putin pause as he's thinking about the long-term costs of invading Ukraine.
The SWIFT system stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT provides a secure way for financial institutions to exchange information about things like money transfers. SWIFT doesn't actually move money, but it does function as a middleman to verify information. SWIFT operates out of Belgium. That means the US would need the support of European allies in order to kick Russia out of the SWIFT community. President Biden has threatened to cut Russia off from SWIFT if they invade Ukraine.
Sending money overseas, receiving money overseas, as well as engaging largely with the international marketplace becomes so much more difficult for Russian institutions. And all of that then has a trickle-down effect on Russian businesses.
It would have tremendous impact on Russian international transactions. It would introduce a lot of volatility to the currency, but there's important questions to ask. First of all, can anyone actually cut Russia off from SWIFT? Why would SWIFT do that? The United States does not have the ability to kick people off SWIFT. The collateral damage would be very significant to SWIFT as an organization.
It's not clear to me that we will engage in kicking Russia out of the SWIFT system, but that would have a huge impact on Russia. There would be some collateral impacts on the United States and on Europe as well. But that has to give Vladimir Putin pause, because it would certainly deny Russia the ability to engage in global transactions.
The thing about sanctions is they're most effective if you don't have to use them. They're most effective if you can credibly threaten something that the other guy doesn't want enough that they don't then do whatever it is you're trying to keep them from doing.
Russia's actually has the second largest number of participants in SWIFT, participating organizations. It would be financially a very poor decision for SWIFT to make And SWIFT can only make that decision if decisions are ratified by Brussels itself, right? So SWIFT is not an organization controlled by the United States. We need to just make that clear. I actually think that a cutoff for Russia from SWIFT is deeply unlikely, but if it was to happen, Russia has some of its own alternative transaction systems, the SPFS system and the national payment card system called MIR that they've instituted. So they have backup options.
Nord Stream 2 is a gas pipeline that connects Russia to Germany via the Baltic Sea. The construction process for the pipeline began in 2013 and has cost $11 billion so far. It would augment the first Nord Stream pipeline, which has been in operation since 2011. Nord Stream 2 is waiting on final certification from German regulators to begin operation. Together, the two pipelines could move 110 billion cubic meters of gas every year. Senator Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire and a senior member of the Committee on Foreign Relations, recently wrote an op-ed with Republican Senator Rob Portman on the importance of standing up to Russia. One key issue was the gas pipeline Nord Stream 2.
Anything that makes Europe more dependent on Russia I believe, is not a good idea. It also bypasses the pipeline that ran through Ukraine in a way that will have an impact on Ukraine.
The views within the German government appear to be divided on this. The German foreign minister has made it very clear that she thinks Nord Stream 2 should be on the table if the Russians attack Ukraine.
In total, Russia provided 48% of the EU's natural gas imports in 2020.
The former Chancellor of Germany made a deal in the summer with President Biden when he waived sanctions on Nord Stream 2, that Nord Stream 2 would be on the table. And my understanding is that Olaf Scholz, her successor, agreed to this. Now, some of the language coming from him and members of his party in senior positions recently has suggested they might be backtracking on this. I'm not sure how seriously I take that. I frankly think that if the Russians are ill-advised enough to actually make a military move on Ukraine, there is absolutely no way politically this pipeline can go into operation without a major political diplomatic damage for the Germans.
Energy clearly is an issue, and we need to provide alternatives so that Europe is not dependent on foreign oil and gas from Russia.
The Russian goal had always been to impose their will on Ukraine, to secure Ukraine's strategic orientation and the like, but without having to actually control the territory or pay for it.
Where we are now, we've just had a series of talks at the presidential leader level, as well as with counterparts between Washington, NATO, and Russia. At the moment, it's still a crisis of the Kremlin's unmaking, and it's really up to President Putin to decide what comes next.
Republican Senator Ted Cruz has proposed a bill that would automatically impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2 if Russia invades Ukraine. In response, Democrats have proposed their own sanctions bill that would give the administration more leeway on the Nord Stream issue. Senator Cruz's bill failed to pass the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. However, it did manage to get some support from Democratic lawmakers.
There are a lot of not just Democratic senators, but also Republican senators who, despite their criticism of the pipeline, which I completely share, it's a bad idea to sanction an ally, to use tools of economic coercion against allies, with which I tend to agree, and that in the current context, it would undercut the Biden administration's extremely careful efforts to create a united front with its NATO allies at a time when the Russians would see this as an invitation to move.
The circumstances are very different than they were when Russia went into Crimea, and we need to do everything possible to make clear to Putin that this is going to be a united response should he take this action.